So you guys wanted it, you guys got it. I am going to be talking about the Brickyard 400, and it was a kind of unprecedented weekend for NASCAR. Both races, the Xfinity Series 250, I will not say the sponsor name of that race, and the Brickyard 400 were both rained out throughout the weekend. In fact, the entire weekend was a wash. No car took to the track Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, leaving this Monday as a doubleheader, 650 miles of racing without the cars having turned a single lap of practice. And that actually turned out pretty well, I think, because of the fact that the teams could not get a handle on the cars and the cool conditions, with, of course, it being later in the year and with the fact that it had been raining for so long, green racetrack, pretty much all the things you could look for some pretty decent racing, all things considered. I think we got that. Now, real quick on the Xfinity race, there's not a whole lot to talk about. Some people wanted me to talk about the package. I think it reminded me quite a bit of the Indy Lights racing that takes place, of course, on Carb Day before the Indy 500. It felt very similar to that. Unfortunately, the one problem exists that seems to exist with pretty much all NASCAR restrictor plate racing, which is that it's very difficult to overtake the leader after a restart, and especially if you've got a teammate like we saw here with Justin Allgaier and Tyler Reddick, where you can have two cars that are going to play friendly with each other. It's very difficult to be able to get a run from third place or fourth place on the track and be able to try to challenge for the lead. There was one great moment, I will admit that, the four-wide finish to a stage. Unfortunately, it didn't matter because it was for a stage win, and ultimately, who cares? But there was a bit of, I guess this turned into a controversy. I'm kind of surprised that it did, but then again, the internet contrarian brigade on Twitter decided to have at me for this one. But yeah, bad look for Justin Allgaier to do a burnout on the bricks. I did not like that. Do not like it. I think it's a bit disrespectful. You can, roast me all you want for that if you feel differently. But ultimately, I think the burnouts are fine, but you don't see the Indy Lights winner burning down his tires on the yard of bricks. So why does Justin Allgaier have a right to do that for an Xfinity victory? Kissing the bricks, that's fine. That's cool. Maybe don't burn out on the bricks. But again, it was it turned into a controversy, and I'm surprised it did. I'm sure people are going to let me know down in the comments what they think of it. But yeah, feel free to do that. But again, I think it's pretty cut and dried that he shouldn't have done that. He did, and it seems to happen all the time. In fact, the winner of the race, if you didn't see the end of the race, I won't spoil it here, but the winner of the Brickyard also did that slightly, and it grinds my gears a little bit, folks. So let's talk about the big prize of the day. The Brickyard 400 led down to the green flag because of the point standings by Kyle Busch and Kevin Harvick. And no real surprise considering recent events. Kyle Busch jetted out to an early lead. And then I've got another complaint about NBC because they went to commercial break 5 laps into the race. And normally that would be a complaint all in and of itself, but it's even worse when NASCAR has 2 mandatory scheduled competition cautions within the first 30 laps of the race, and the first one was occurring at lap 10. So we lost 2 laps of green flag racing on the coverage for absolutely no reason when they could have just held off on the commercials until that competition caution. Speaking of that competition caution, it may have had one of the most significant moments of the race, as sad as that is to say, as everyone decided to come off into the pits. The only person who didn't was Denny Hamlin. That gave him some significant track position on the restart. Also worth noting during this whole competition caution kerfluffle, I guess you could say, prior to the caution coming out, Kevin Harvick came into the pits, which looked like it was going to be a brilliant strategy move. Turned out he had a penalty for an uncontrolled tire. There was something like 5 throughout the race, and that was something that Steve Letarte seemed to be pretty upset about. Again, I hadn't seen that being an issue in NASCAR recently. Maybe it's a more recent thing. Certainly, I didn't see it happening very much during the Southern 500, but it's possible that maybe they're just cracking down prior to the chase. Regardless, Hamlin was up front for the restart and would actually begin to pull away. And it definitely seemed to me like clean air was a major factor, as it usually is at Indianapolis. It seemed if you were up front, you were going to have a great shot at staying up front. And a real quick point on competition cautions, especially in a race like this where theoretically the competition caution is there for a safety reason because they're not entirely sure what the tires are going to do because there's been no track time. Well, why would you mandate a caution when you make it optional for the teams to come in and change tires, or at least take the tires off so NASCAR and Goodyear can inspect them? That was not the case. That's why you saw Hamlin go out into the lead of the race, because he called a brilliant, I will attest, strategy call. But ultimately, are the competition cautions there for safety, or are they there to bunch up the field? Let's be honest with ourselves here, NASCAR. If you want to add more stages to the races, just add more stages and award points while you're at it if you're going to, put the teams through a hoop like that. Again, it was just kind of strange that they added 2 competition cautions. We really didn't see any tire issues throughout the race. Maybe there was a couple, but most of those had to do with contact on track prior to the tire going down. So really there wasn't any tire issues. Really there wasn't an issue, period, in terms of the setup of the car or the compatibility with the track, like we saw 10 years ago with the 2008 debacle. I don't see the point of doing the competition cautions. I really don't. I did not see a real reason to have those in the race in this particular instance. And if you do, if it is a safety thing, you should bring the entire field in and not allow any strategy to go on. That was actually one thing, a point about the 2008 Brickyard that was actually probably good in retrospect, that they didn't let teams start playing with the strategy throughout the competition cautions. They brought everybody into the pits. They penalized people who pitted before the competition. I mean, if you're going to manage it, if you're going to manage the race, might as well manage it, I suppose. So then we get to a pretty significant moment in the race. Martin Truex Jr., one of the NASCAR Big Three, and in Furniture Row Racing's final Brickyard 400, has a brake failure going into turn 1. Thankfully, he was able to whoa the car down, despite the fact that it actually damaged the car quite significantly, despite the fact that he actually never made contact with anything outside of the brake rotor going through the top of his car. But that put Truex out of the race and took away a chance for him to really put an exclamation mark going into the chase. We saw another brake failure later on in the race with Bubba Wallace in the STP car. That was a very scary situation, very similar to something that happened to him at Pocono, where he spun through the infield grass in turn 3, came up through the onto the track, somehow managed to keep it off the wall, and it looked like, hey, he's going to maybe be able to get back in the race. They'll just repair. Oh, no, David Starr ARCA braked into him. Oh, what a shame. Yeah, that was a shame, and that put an end to Bubba Wallace's Brickyard 400. And then we get back to the green, another crash. This time, A.J. Allmendinger and Alex Bowman. Bowman was pretty much an innocent bystander in this one. Allmendinger gets up into him, spins into the inside wall. Bowman actually keeps going, actually gets into the pits, and they actually do the 5-minute caution clock repair. And here's a problem I have with the 5-minute caution clock, is that they sent Bowman back out onto the track. He was belching smoke. The tire, there was an incredible tire rub on his car. And I was thinking, my God, this is unsafe. Why is he going out here and running, clearly very fast as well? And then NASCAR announces, well, everyone made a minimum speed, and now Alex Bowman can come back into the pits and do as many repairs as they want to the car and get him out so he can continue in the race safely. Does somebody, just correct me if I'm wrong, but is somebody seeing the fail in logic here? You're sending a car out with 5 minutes of repair jobs, and you're saying you have to run whatever the minimum speed is. Let's say just arbitrarily it's 165 mile an hour, lap average. You've just wrecked your car. You've done 5 minutes of repairs to it, and you're being expected to run 165 miles an hour with a tire rub. For safety? For what? And then you let him repair the car to the best extent the crew can, and he finishes the race. Well, why didn't you just let him do that to begin with? I do not understand this rule. It's terrible. It is so bad. And it's completely arbitrary as far as I'm concerned. I mean, it was much more dangerous to send him out with that damage than to just have the crew do a proper repair job, which they were clearly capable of. And, I could not believe that. That was a head-scratching moment for me. And then we get to one of the best stories of the race, at least for me. Matt Kenseth filling in for Trevor Bayne. Well, not really filling in, kind of replacing Trevor Bayne. Was absolutely flying through the field. NBC was quick to point out that they were adding a lot of tape to the front grille of his car. It was nice to see because it was bright orange. Love the day glow. Makes it very easy to tell what's going on. And yeah, it was clear that his car was working incredibly well in traffic. He was one of the few drivers able to pass, and boy, did he pass. He passed so many cars, it was unbelievable. I think I even tweeted at one point, he's 100% of the entertainment value of this race. And indeed he was. And I will say this, if the Xfinity package had been here for this race, so let's talk the restrictor plate drafting package, Kenseth wouldn't have been able to make half of those moves that he was. A lot of those moves were based on horsepower down the straightaway and the ability to get the throttle on coming in and out of the corner. He was driving into the corners so much deeper than so many other of the drivers. It was really unbelievable. It's a bit of a shame things turned out the way that they did for Kenseth in this race, because he was really coming to the front a significant amount, and it was really exciting to watch. So then we have a theme in this race of backmarkers getting into each other. J.J. Yaley gets into another slow car. I don't remember exactly which one it is. It was a red car, and then spins off of the turn 2 wall in the Smokey and the Bandit tribute car. That was a bit of a shame, especially because it did kind of throw a monkey wrench into some of the strategies heading in to the end of the second stage, and we'll get to that here in just a second. So yeah, speaking of strategy, everybody started peeling off into the pit lane. All the front runners, Bowyer, Hamlin, you got Harvick and Keselowski, and all those guys who seemed like they were going to be threatening for the eventual win of the race were kind of saying, we don't really want these stage points. We're not that interested in them. Well, guess what Roush Fenway Racing did? They were like, we're going for the stage points. And they did with Matt Kenseth. They took a stage win. Generally, I'm not that interested in the stages. I could care less. They're ultimately mandatory cautions to me. But I want a stage win t-shirt and diecast for Matt Kenseth. It's probably the biggest win Roush Racing has had in quite a while outside of the plate track. So that was kind of neat to see. Matt Kenseth, especially because he genuinely had a car to run up front. It's kind of unfortunate that the strategy calls didn't quite get him where he deserved to be, because I think ultimately towards the end of the race, if they had gone on the Hamlin strategy and then maybe gone with tires towards the last restart, I think Kenseth would have been in that position to be able to challenge Hamlin towards the end of the race because of just how well his car was handling. You get him on fresh tires, I think he would have gone straight to the front. That was another thing that was kind of interesting about this whole race. It seemed like Toyota was the early favorites, as they kind of have been in recent Brickyard 400s. They've been just seemed to be the class of the field. But throughout the middle of this race, you had the 4 Stewart-Haas cars up there. You had the Roush cars looking very strong and the Penske cars. So a lot of Fords were running up at the front of this race, which I kind of found interesting. It's also going to be interesting next year when they switch to the Mustang bodies, if they have the performance laps that kind of some of the Chevy teams have had this year. So the race kind of became a 2-horse race between Clint Bowyer, who looked like he was really dominant in this race up until this point, and Denny Hamlin, who was able to hang on to the back of Clint Bowyer. But as races in Indianapolis usually turn out, strategy was a major contributing factor to the end of this race. And it was an undercut, a Formula One style pit lane move by Denny Hamlin was the thing that managed to get him out in front of Clint Bowyer. They pitted about 2 or 3 laps earlier than Bowyer did, got on fresh tires, were able to kind of propel themselves forward using some of that clean air once again. And as Bowyer was exiting the pits, it was Hamlin taking the lead. So now it was game on. Bowyer was chasing down Hamlin, which he seemed to be doing in lap traffic. It looked like we were going to have a pretty fantastic duel to the finish between the two of these drivers over the last few laps of the race. And then what do we have? Debris flying off the Starcom racing car of Landon Castle, bringing out the yellow, and everyone collectively was having flashbacks to last year's Brickyard 400, where it took an hour to complete, I think, 15 laps. And everybody was like, oh boy, here we go. And it didn't really disappoint, because we had some cars coming into the pits for fresh tires, some cars staying out on the track. Some notable exceptions to this, of course, were Hamlin and Bowyer, as well as Jamie McMurray, or McFlurry, as I call him in the games. And McFlurry was an animal on the restart, almost turning Clint Bowyer in front of the field, and boy, would that have been something to behold if that had happened. But it gave Hamlin the opportunity to spring away and build a gap, and it looked like Hamlin was going to go on to his first Brickyard 400 win, but then an absolutely savage accident between Jeffrey Earnhardt and Landon Cassill. And I'll tell you what, seeing this crash for the first time, or at least the aftermath of Landon Cassill's car, I was a bit worried. It definitely looked like the chassis, the center of the chassis, had been compromised on Landon Cassill's car, and indeed it had been just an absolutely savage crash with Earnhardt getting up into the wall in or up into the air in turn 3, of course the wall too, as well as Landon Cassill. A terrible looking accident. Thankfully both drivers were okay, but it set up one whale of a finish, because suddenly, out of nowhere seemingly, Brad Keselowski is sitting third with fresh tires on the restart, and he got the jump on Clint Bowyer, who Bowyer had been kind of sleeping on the restarts all day. It was kind of interesting. He'd slept on that restart with McFlurry as well, and it was able to get behind Hamlin. And then we had probably the best finish the Brickyard 400 has ever had. Coming into turn 3, or coming out of turn 2, I should say, side-by-side racing, beating and banging down the back straightaway. That's how you do it, Austin. You don't turn the guy, you just rub him a little bit. They went side-by-side into turn 3, into turn 4, and Keselowski was able to take the lead. And big shout-out goes out to Eric Jones, because it looked like Jones, I mean, if Hamlin had been able to keep Keselowski side-by-side for just a couple more feet, Jones would have probably had the run. They would have been probably 3 wide going into turn 1, and possibly Eric Jones coming out with the kind of advantage in that area. And I certainly think Jones deserves a big shout out for the way he drove this race. I haven't been the biggest cheerleader for Eric Jones over the years, but I'm going to call it out when he does a great job. And I think this was a really sterling performance today, especially when you compare him to a teammate like Suarez, who is running near the back most of the day, or mid-pack, I should say. There's probably a reason why they're looking at replacing Suarez with Truex. I mean, if you just look at stats, unfortunately, in terms of that one. But yeah, Brad Keselowski finally breaks through and gets Roger Penske his first Brickyard 400 win. And yes, he did burn out a little bit on the bricks, and that did trigger me a little bit. But yeah, it was kind of cool to see Keselowski do it. I definitely thought Hamlin probably was the driver that deserved the win, but ultimately it's the fastest car and the fastest driver that wins, and that was Brad Keselowski. And it's kind of interesting that Roger Penske, for whatever reason, wasn't there this weekend. There was a phone call that Brad had to make to let Roger know that they had taken the victory. But yeah, it's probably, again, I think a lot of this had to do with the fact that there was not a lot of track time prior to the start of the race. But again, I kind of expected that to a weird certain extent. Because if you don't give the teams a lot of opportunity to do setup work, a lot of them are going to have to operate on the fly. And it's not really a surprise that you saw a lot of the teams and more experienced drivers, more experienced teams and more experienced drivers, like at Kenseth with Roush, or you look at Gibbs and Penske, were able to figure that out very quickly. And ultimately, it kind of created a pretty even race at the front of the field. And we got to pass on the next to last lap, or at least come into the white flag of the Brickyard 400. I don't think that's ever happened. There's always been kind of the last pass hasn't really happened towards the end of the race, or at least that close to the end of the race. So best finish in Brickyard 400 history, a pretty decent race. There's one thing you haven't heard me comment on this whole time, and that's the crowd. And that's because ultimately, first of all, it's probably it's beating a dead horse at this point. There's not really a whole lot to say, well, okay, yeah, the crowd sucked. It always sucks at this point. So that's not really a point to be made. And also, it was a Monday race with no track time. And I think there was even a bit of a threat of rain today in the Indianapolis area. So, that's not really something to point out. Now, are there improvements that need to be made at the Brickyard 400 as an event? I would certainly think so. I can't imagine that there's that many people who just have decided that they no longer want to show up to the Brickyard. And I think you could convince a certain amount of people to come back. You can revitalize an event. Just look at the Indy 500 as an example of that. With the amount of empty seats that were around like 2009, 2010, 2012, and you look at it now, and there's probably another 20,000 people there than were there in the previous years. Now, is that a massive leap? Would that be a massive leap for the Brickyard? Probably not, but 20,000 tickets more sold is 20,000 tickets more sold. My suggestion has always been, maybe a lot of people have said put it on the road course or bring it to IRP. I think the Xfinity Series absolutely needs to be at IRP. The fact that they run the actual speedway is a little bit rich for my blood. But I think you do a combo of the two ideas. I think on Saturday, you get rid of the Xfinity race, you run a 200-mile event on the road course. Then you go to the oval, run a 200-mile-hour, yes, but 200-mile sprint race on the oval. Call it the Brickyard 400, but call it the Brickyard 400 weekend. You sell twice the tickets, give the fans twice the racing, give the fans some variety, and give the fans a sprint race on the ovals. Isn't that been the complaint about NASCAR? The races are too long. Give them a short, sweet, exciting race. And it's clear that they can put on a decent race if you put them under the right parameters. Hey, maybe don't give them any oval track time at all. Maybe all the practice and qualifying happens on the road course. Maybe even do the qualifications for the oval race with the results of the road course race. That could be interesting. That could be really interesting. And award full points for both races while you're at it. But that's just my suggestion. I think it was a decent race. I think it was one of the better Brickyard 400s I've seen. I certainly don't like the gimmicks. You guys are well aware at that at this point. Competition cautions were unnecessary. Playoffs, something like that. Yeah, there was some playoff thing on the line. It really didn't matter because the Hendrick cars were locked in. The only way they would get knocked out was if a non-playoff contender who is chase eligible, meaning if Kenseth didn't get in, or if Kenseth won the race, then he wouldn't have got in, but Kyle Busch got in that one time, and they have a history of putting other drivers in. But never mind. Yeah, and Kyle Busch is the regular season champion. So if he doesn't win the championship like proper, that's the guy who deserves it. Is that what we're going at now? I don't know. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you don't get too mad at me. Hope you don't get too mad at me about the bricks either. It's okay. We can have differing opinions, even though you're wrong if you think you should do bonus on the bricks. But subscribe for more motorsport content. Leave a like on this video if you did enjoy it. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. The discussion is always interesting, so I appreciate it. And we'll see you in the next video.